black woman's boarding pass labeled suspicious. The airline CEO's reaction stuns everyone. Imagine this, you're at the airport, ready for an important trip. Everything seems routine, but then something unthinkable happens. This story isn't just about one woman. It's about standing up against injustice, confronting systemic bias, and demanding accountability. By the end of this tale, you'll see how Naomi's courage sparked change in ways no one could have predicted. But before we dive into the details, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. If stories of courage, resilience, and justice inspire you, hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us share more incredible stories like this one. Let's get started. Here we go. The airport buzzed with energy as travelers moved through the terminal, their steps echoing against polished floors. Announcements filled the air, suitcases rolled briskly, and the occasional laughter from a nearby cafe broke through the hum. Amid the organized chaos stood Maya Reed, a composed and determined woman preparing for an important international conference. Her tailored blazer and minimalist accessories gave her an air of quiet authority, and with a glance at the departure board, she adjusted her grip on a well-worn leather bag and stepped confidently into the boarding line. This trip was more than just routine. It was the culmination of months of hard work. Maya's mind raced through the agenda ahead, but she remained calm, her focus unwavering. The line shuffled forward, and she exchanged a polite smile with the family ahead of her. As she approached the gate, the agent, Ethan Gray, caught her eye. His expression was tight, almost scrutinizing, as though he'd already decided there was something unusual about her. Maya handed over her boarding pass with a polite nod, but Ethan barely acknowledged her. His brow furrowed as he stared at her ticket for an uncomfortably long moment. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his tone sharp enough to turn a few heads nearby. Along with a special pass, her ticket safely turned back onto my ticket. Her arrival swift and neglected. Caught off guard, Maya replied firmly but calmly, "I booked it online, just like everyone else." And Ethan's lips curled into a thin smirk. "Well, it's flagged as suspicious. I'll need to verify it." The passengers behind her began to mutter, their impatience growing, but Maya stayed composed. "The ticket is valid," she said evenly, her voice steady despite the tension. "Feel free to check the details." Instead of responding, Ethan motioned to the side, directing her to step away for further questioning. Maya felt the weight of countless stares on her as she complied, her resolve unshaken. This was just the beginning of an ordeal that would leave the entire airport and an airline's leadership stunned. As Maya stood to the side, the murmurs of the crowd behind her grew louder. People whispered, their curious and judgmental gazes darting in her direction. She held her head high, refusing to let their stares rattle her. Ethan Gray, the gate agent, kept his smirk as he typed on his terminal. Moments later, two uniformed security officers approached her. The taller officer, Sergeant Blake, had a stern expression that gave away no emotion, while Officer Tanner, shorter and visibly less professional, seemed almost amused by the situation. "Ma'am," Blake began in a clipped tone, "we need to ask you some questions regarding your boarding pass." Maya's voice was calm but firm. "What kind of questions could you possibly have about a boarding pass?" "It's flagged in our system as suspicious," Blake replied, his tone suggesting the answer was obvious. "I've already provided my ID and explained that I'm traveling for official business. Everything is in order," Maya said, maintaining her poise despite the rising tension. Tanner smirked, leaning in slightly. "Just hand over your documents and let us do our job," he said in a tone dripping with condescension. Maya's jaw tightened, but she reached into her bag and handed over her passport. Her fingers brushed against the sealed folder containing sensitive documents, but she left it untouched. The officers flipped through her passport, their expressions unchanged. "It's standard procedure," Blake said dismissively, his words doing little to mask the undertones of prejudice. Maya glanced around briefly. Passengers in line watched with a mix of curiosity and unease. Some whispered among themselves, while others shot her accusatory looks as if she'd done something wrong. Barrington filled me in on his decision. One man in a suit muttered, "Just let her through already, we're all waiting." But his voice carried more frustration than support. The officers exchanged a look, and Blake motioned to Tanner, who stepped forward to inspect her bag. Maya felt a surge of heat in her chest. Her bag wasn't just filled with personal belongings, it carried important documents for her work. "You have no reason to search my things," she stated firmly, her voice steady despite the humiliation washing over her. "It's protocol," Blake said coldly. As Tanner began rifling through her belongings, Maya stood motionless, her resolve unwavering. She could feel her heart pounding, but she refused to let it show. Around her, the whispers of the onlookers grew louder, each one feeling like a dagger. Suddenly, Tanner pulled out the sealed folder and held it up. The golden insignia on the cover gleamed under the fluorescent lights. "What's this?" he asked, his tone laced with suspicion. "That's confidential," Maya replied, her voice carrying an air of quiet authority. Tanner hesitated for a moment, seemingly unsure of how to proceed. Blake's smirk faltered as the situation escalated further. It was clear they hadn't expected Maya to hold her ground so firmly, and he knew this was because she wanted. Despite the humiliation and the weight of countless judgmental stares, Maya's dignity remained intact. Little did the officers know, their actions were about to unravel into something far bigger than they could have imagined. The crowd murmured louder as tension filled the air. This was no longer about a boarding pass, it was a battle against prejudice. And Maya was determined not to back down. Just as the tension at the gate reached its peak, a calm yet commanding voice cut through the noise. "Is there a problem here?" The murmurs of the crowd hushed, as all eyes turned to see a tall man in a sharp suit striding toward the scene. His presence radiated authority, and his identification badge gleamed in the fluorescent light. The badge bore the unmistakable silver lettering, "Mark Patterson, Deputy Director of Diplomatic Security." His patter inferred. Sergeant Blake straightened instinctively, his stern demeanor faltering for the first time. Officer Tanner, still clutching Maya's sealed folder, glanced nervously at his superior. Mark's sharp gaze swept over the officers, taking in their defensive postures and the folder in Tanner's hands. Then his eyes met Maya's, and his expression softened slightly. He handed the folder over to her, half taken prisoner. Angel took out her boy support son, her instincts telling her to smile. "Ma'am, are you all right?" Mark asked, his voice carrying a note of genuine concern. Maya nodded, though her voice carried a trace of weariness as she replied, "I'll be fine, but this situation is unacceptable." Mark turned back to the officers, his tone hardening. "What exactly are you doing here?" Blake cleared his throat, struggling to maintain his composure. "We're verifying suspicious documentation, sir. It's protocol." Mark raised an eyebrow. "Suspicious documentation?" He gestured to the folder Tanner still held. "That's classified material, clearly marked with a presidential insignia, and you're handling it like a piece of contraband?" The two men looked at each other, and Alistair said. Tanner's smirk vanished, replaced by a pale expression of dread. Blake stammered, We didn't realize." "You didn't realize?" Mark interrupted, his voice growing sharper. "Or you didn't care? This isn't just mishandling a passenger's belongings. It's a direct violation of federal protocols, not to mention a blatant display of bias." Blake and Tanner exchanged uneasy glances, but Mark wasn't finished. "Do you even know who you're dealing with?" he demanded. Without waiting for an answer, he turned to the crowd. "For anyone wondering, Ms. Reed is a U.S. diplomat traveling on official business. Her work directly impacts international policy. The fact that you singled her out like this is not just unprofessional, it's disgraceful." Gasps rippled through the onlookers, and the officers visibly shrank under the weight of Mark's words. Ethan Gray, the gate agent, who had been standing stiffly nearby, looked as though he wished the ground would swallow him whole. "Mr. Gray," Mark said, addressing the agent directly, "explain to me why this boarding pass was flagged as suspicious." Ethan opened his mouth, but no words came out. Finally, he muttered, It must have been a system error, and slowly put the glass down. A system error, Mark repeated, his tone dripping with skepticism. Convenient. But I think we all know what the real issue is here. At that moment, a middle-aged man in a crisp suit hurried into the scene. His name tag read Jonathan Hughes, airline manager. His face was flushed, and he looked as though he'd been briefed on the situation during his sprint to the gate. "Mr. Patterson, I assure you this is not how we operate," Hughes said breathlessly. "This was an unfortunate misunderstanding." "Misunderstanding?" Mark snapped, his focus now shifting to Hughes. "This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was a failure, a systemic one, that allowed your staff to target a diplomat based on prejudice." Hughes swallowed hard, his earlier confidence replaced with a look of unease. "We'll investigate this thoroughly and take immediate action against those responsible," he promised. "Immediate action isn't enough," Mark said firmly. "You need to address the culture that allowed this to happen in the first place." She sighed. By now, the crowd had fallen completely silent, watching the scene unfold with rapt attention. Maya, standing tall despite the ordeal, caught the eye of a young woman nearby, who gave her a small, encouraging nod. Hughes nodded hastily. Of course. Miss Reed, on behalf of the airline, I deeply apologize for this experience. Please allow me to personally ensure that you board your flight without any further trouble." Miss Reed made a withdrawal power before closing the door, placing one hand to scratch behind her ear. Maya's expression remained calm, though her voice carried a tone of quiet resolve. "Your apology is noted, Mr. Hughes, but this isn't just about me. It's about ensuring this doesn't happen to anyone else." Hughes nodded again, looking chastened. "Absolutely. We'll make this right." Mark stepped closer to Maya, his tone softening. "Ms. Reed, if you're ready, I'll personally escort you to your flight." With a final glance at the officers and the gate agent, Mark added, "And you can rest assured this incident will be reported at the highest levels." I will never forget it. As Maya walked toward the boarding gate with Mark by her side, the weight of the ordeal began to lift. She knew the battle wasn't over. Systemic change takes time, but this moment marked a turning point. She had stood her ground, exposed the injustice, and ensured the voices of countless others wouldn't be silenced. The lack of attention that followed implied the boiling point of the Mel was about to swim underneath. As Maya walked toward the boarding gate with Mark by her side, she thought. Meanwhile, Jonathan Hughes, the airline manager, stared after them, his expression a mix of regret and determination. The CEO's response to this unfolding scandal would soon make headlines, but for now, Maya's quiet dignity had left an indelible mark on everyone who witnessed the scene. Strangers moved slowly, feeling their way through the crowd, lest they be uneasy. Days after the incident at the airport, Maya Reed sat in a sleek conference room at the airline's corporate headquarters. The floor-to-ceiling windows framed the bustling city below, a stark contrast to the tense air inside the room. Across the table sat Jonathan Hughes, the airline CEO, flanked by Karen Ellis, the chief diversity officer, and a handful of senior executives. The only one of the crew here who ascended the ranks in the sitting room was resigned, and her Panzer PCP suit. Maya's calm composure concealed the emotional toll of the incident. She had faced not only humiliation but also the weight of representing countless others who had experienced similar prejudice, but lacked the platform to speak out. She was here not for retribution, but to demand accountability and push for systemic change. "It was not the horse's fault," said Billy, with a grim expression. "Without the man behind the wheel, we wouldn't be able to hurt so many." Jonathan Hughes began the meeting with a direct acknowledgement. "Mr. Reed, on behalf of the airline, I want to extend my sincerest apologies for the events that unfolded. What you experienced was unacceptable, and I take full responsibility for the actions of our staff." Maya nodded, her expression unwavering. "I appreciate the apology, Mr. Hughes, but words alone are not enough. This isn't just about me. It's about addressing the systemic issues that allowed this to happen." Karen Ellis leaned forward, her tone measured but earnest. "We've conducted a thorough review of the incident. The gate agent, Ethan Gray, and the 2 security officers involved have been terminated. Additionally, we've identified gaps in our training programs and are committed to addressing them immediately." Maya raised an eyebrow, her voice calm but firm. "Terminating a few employees might address the symptoms, but it doesn't solve the root problem. The culture that allowed this kind of behavior to thrive must change." "Yes," Hughes nodded, acknowledging her point. "You're absolutely right. That's why we've taken this as an opportunity to reevaluate our policies and practices. Karen has already begun developing a comprehensive bias training program for all employees, from frontline staff to senior leadership." "Walk me through it," Hughes asked, unsure what kind of social significance might be associated with it. Karen chimed in. "This isn't just a one-time training session. We're creating a long-term strategy that includes ongoing education, accountability measures, and mechanisms for employees to report discriminatory behavior without fear of retaliation." Maya leaned back slightly, her expression thoughtful. "That's a step in the right direction, but systemic change requires more than policies. It requires leadership to set the example." "Like you," Maya smiled. Maya paused for a breath and said. Hughes frowned slightly. "What do you suggest?" Maya's tone was resolute. "Transparency and accountability. Publish your diversity and inclusion metrics annually. Show the public that you're not just making promises, but actively working toward measurable progress. And involve diverse voices in decision-making at every level of the organization." "What's the problem?" he asked, as he settled down to his work and scanned the latest decision-making panel. Karen exchanged a glance with Hughes, who nodded slowly. "We can do that," Hughes said. "It won't be easy, but we're committed to doing what's necessary to rebuild trust, not just with you, but with every customer who flies with us." Maya's gaze remained steady. "Rebuilding trust isn't just about restoring a damaged reputation. It's about ensuring that no one else has to endure what I did. This is bigger than one incident. It's about setting a precedent." The room fell silent for a moment as her words sank in. Then Hughes spoke again, his voice more determined. "You're right, Ms. Reed. This moment has to mean something. We'll follow through not just because it's the right thing to do, but because it's necessary for the kind of company we aspire to be." The meeting ended with a sense of cautious optimism. Maya knew that systemic change would take time, but she was determined to hold the airline accountable. As she walked out of the building, the sun reflected off the glass facade, a symbolic reminder of both the challenges ahead and the potential for transformation. He heard the woman's wallet hang on the doorknob as she tried to leave. The lock twitched as the woman shut the door behind her. In the weeks that followed, the airline began rolling out its promised reforms. Public statements detailed their commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and the company partnered with advocacy groups to ensure their efforts were guided by expertise and lived experiences. For Maya, the incident became a catalyst for a broader conversation about prejudice and privilege. She was invited to speak at a high-preface forum on diversity and inclusion in corporate culture, where her words resonated deeply with executives, activists, and everyday citizens. "Accountability isn't about blaming individuals," Maya said during her speech. "It's about recognizing and dismantling the systems that perpetuate bias. Change begins when leaders are willing to ask the hard questions, confront uncomfortable truths, and take meaningful action." The standing ovation that followed reaffirmed her belief in the power of resilience and advocacy. The airline CEO, Jonathan Hughes, was in the audience that day, and he approached her afterward. "Maya," he said, extending a hand, "your speech was powerful. Thank you for challenging us to be better. It's not always easy to hear, but it's necessary." Maya shook his hand, her expression firm yet gracious. "It's not about easy or hard. It's about what's right. Change is only possible if you're committed to the follow-through." As the airline began to implement its reforms, Maya's story served as a reminder of the power of standing up against injustice. What had started as a moment of humiliation turned into a powerful fight for accountability and change, one that resonated far beyond the airport gates. For Maya, the battle wasn't over, but as she reflected on the journey so far, she knew one thing for certain. Her resilience had sparked something much larger, a movement toward a more just and equitable future. Weeks after the incident at the airport, Maya Reed stood on the podium of a grand conference hall. The audience, a mix of corporate executives, activists, and media representatives, waited in anticipation. The Forum on Diversity and Inclusion in Corporate Culture was a direct outcome of Maya's courageous stand, and her story had become a rallying point for change. And then, dressed in a sleek navy blazer, Maya radiated confidence as she approached the microphone. She took a deep breath, scanning the room. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice calm but resolute. "What happened to me at the airport was not an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a much larger issue, systemic prejudice that permeates not just our institutions but our culture." She closed her eyes and put her hand over the press's headphones. "First, unless I'm mistaken, if you happen to see them," her words resonated deeply as she shared the story of her ordeal, not with anger but with a determination to inspire action. Bias, whether intentional or unconscious, has real consequences. It shapes how we see others and how we treat them. And in that moment at the airport, I was reduced to a label: suspicious. But labels don't define people. Our actions do. And that's why I'm here today to take action. Maya spoke about the importance of accountability, emphasizing that true change requires more than policies and public statements. It requires courage from leaders to confront uncomfortable truths, to dismantle systems of inequity, and to create spaces where everyone feels they belong. Sympathetic friendliness poured from everyone on the flight, and Maya kindly inserted $5 into change. She seemed sympathetic and quickly made her final transportation payment. As she concluded, she left the audience with a powerful message. Every action we take, big or small, contributes to a culture, and it is up to us to decide whether that culture uplifts and includes or excludes and diminishes. The choice is ours. Side note: Panhandle Stolulis, the Japanese film The Consequences, actors Jude Doyle and Frankenstein dying in the Fast and Furious 5. The room erupted in a standing ovation. Maya stepped back from the podium, her heart pounding with a mix of emotion and relief. She had turned her moment of humiliation into a movement for awareness and accountability. Among the crowd, she caught the gaze of Jonathan Hughes, the airline CEO. He nodded in acknowledgement, a silent affirmation of the commitment he had promised. Later that evening, Maya found herself at her family home, sitting on the porch with her younger brother, Caleb. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. Caleb handed her a glass of wine, his eyes full of admiration. "You were incredible today," he said, breaking the comfortable silence. "Hi," she said, leaning up to kiss him. Maya smiled, swirling the wine in her glass. "It wasn't just about me, Caleb. It's about everyone who's ever been judged unfairly or made to feel like they didn't belong." Caleb nodded thoughtfully. "You know, Mom and Dad would be so proud of you. They taught us to stand tall, even when the odds are against us." Maya's smile softened, her eyes misting at the mention of their late parents. "Everything I do, it's because of them. They showed us what it means to fight for what's right, no matter the cost." Caleb raised his glass in a toast. "To them, and to you, for carrying their legacy forward." They clinked glasses, the sound ringing softly in the quiet evening. For a moment, Maya allowed herself to savor the peace, the warmth of family, and the knowledge that she had turned a painful experience into something meaningful. As the stars began to dot the night sky, Maya felt a renewed sense of purpose. Her journey was far from over, but she knew she wasn't alone. Her voice had sparked a conversation, and that conversation was spreading, rippling outward to touch lives and challenge perceptions. She leaned back, gazing at the stars, ready for whatever came next. Maya's story is more than a tale of one woman's resilience. It's a powerful reminder of the courage it takes to stand up against prejudice. Her unwavering determination not only exposed the injustices she faced, but also sparked meaningful conversations about systemic bias and the urgent need for change. Every one of us has a role to play in challenging the biases that exist in our workplaces, communities, and even within ourselves. It starts with asking the hard questions, speaking up when we witness injustice, and holding those in power accountable. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it begins with brave actions like Maya's. Arbin Kapper. Now, we want to hear from you. How would you stand up against prejudice if faced with a similar situation? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story moved or inspired you, don't forget to hit the like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that spark reflection and action. Together we can amplify these voices, challenge systemic injustice, and create a world where everyone is treated with dignity and respect. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.